and System Analysis from Wageningen University. And FSD is also located in Wageningen. And my motivation, and also I think my dedication to work for FSD and in this sector at large, is to really bring nature into decision making and to ensure that nature conservation and also restoration are not seen as something which costs society, but something which societies and our economies gain from. And that seems to perfectly align with the time we live in, as there are still many steps to be taken. And this also fits with the philosophy of FSD and has been for the past 20 years already. It's an organization founded in 2000 by two professors of Wageningen University, Dolf de Groot and Arnold van Vliet. And we run 3 programs, one of which is the Ecosystem Services Partnership, as you can see here in the left, in small. And ESP connects over 3,000 experts and practitioners worldwide on the topic of ecosystem services. And of course, we also host the Ecosystem Services Valuation database, as you can see in the middle, which stands pretty much at the basis of the project we will present to you today. So if you can move to the next slide. This webinar will be recorded, so take the necessary precautions if needed. And I think the recording has started or will start now. Questions can be posed in the Q&A section. So you can find it above. It says Q&A, and other remarks or general points you can put in the chat function. So we hope to keep them separated, and let's see in how far we can keep it separated. And at the end of the webinar, we have dedicated 15 to 20 minutes to discuss your questions and comments and also your experience maybe with ecosystem services valuation. And we would like, as I mentioned, we would like to have interaction. So we would like to give people who have posed questions or remarks the floor. So please, when asked, you can turn on your microphone. You can raise your hand and turn on your microphone. And of course, for those who do not feel comfortable to do so, we can ask the questions ourselves and have the panel respond. We also have a Mentimeter. It would be best to use your phone, and this is the code, but this will also be shown later. And for now, as I mentioned before, if possible, to mute yourself. If you can go to the next slide, we see the core team who worked on the project and who are available for you also as speakers now and panelists. There's a small change though, due to illness. Mieke Siebers, Executive Director of FSD, will not be hosting the Q&A and the interview, but Caroline van Leenders from the Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality will take over. But Mieke is here in support, and she's here in the background. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the program. First, I will give a short introduction on the relevance of ecosystem services valuation. Then we will hear from Roel Nozeman from the ASN Bank about ASN's mission to make nature count. Thirdly, at 14:20 more or less, we'll hear from Siets de Jong about the actual content, the actual work we have done, so that's very important. Then we will move to a conversation on the usefulness of ecosystem service valuation for financial institutions by Caroline van Leenders and Karin van Dijk. Karin van Dijk is from ASN Impact Investors. And approximately 35 minutes in, we will move from sharing to more interaction and feedback. First with a Mentimeter. As I mentioned, it would be best to use your phone with some questions, also to digest a bit what has been mentioned before. Then we'll have some short comments on collaborative opportunities. And then we have 15 to 20 minutes for a Q&A session, ending with some final takeaways. And in the Q&A session, the whole project team from FSD and ASN are here for all your questions and remarks. As you saw them before, they will all be in the Q&A session. And now I would like to also thank shortly Karin van Dijk from ASN Impact Investors, SLM Fund, Alessia Lenders, and Amazon Biodiversity Fund, Nick Oakes, for their cooperation and for providing us with the actual cases, the investment cases for us to assess and the data, and also for giving feedback on the report, etc. I also want to thank Iskra Kanowska from FSD, who is assisting with the webinar in the background. And also I would like to thank Dolf de Groot, who was also one of the authors of the report. Then let's get back to the project and what we did. As you're probably aware, 2.0 means that there was also a 1.0 predecessor, which actually was, and you can find more information on this project on esvd.info and now also in the chat. And in the second Make Nature Count project, we used the Ecosystem Services Valuation Database, the ESVD, a monetary valuation database and tool, and also data from scientific literature to measure the impact of 2 actual ASN Bank investments. And this allowed us to indicate and place an economic value on ecosystems or nature, and to show the impacts that investments have on ecosystem services and therefore on our well-being, which I will come back to later. And maybe an important note before we dive into the project and the findings, this is still very much piloting work. It's unique because we're moving really from scientific theories and apply them to practice, in this case, to investment cases. And while this concept of ecosystem services and also the monetary valuation of ecosystem services has been around for over 40 years, I will set the scene and shortly show something on the ecosystem service and how it can be linked to measuring impact using monetary valuation. If you could go to the next slide. So, ecosystem services. The thinking on ecosystem services was developed to link societies and natural systems and to understand the impact and dependencies that we have on nature and we as humans have on nature. And that's also very much in the definition of ecosystem services, namely the benefits that humans receive from nature. And if you can click next, you will see that the tree will become a bit fuller. Ecosystem services is just another way of saying that our well-being is very much dependent on nature, on ecosystems, and is conceptualized through ecosystem services. And because we really like to categorize things to make sense in a chaotic world, the concept of ecosystem services recognizes 3 or 4, depending really on who you ask, types of ecosystem service categories, and you see them here. Maybe to start in the top left, you have these provisioning ecosystem services. They might be the easier ones to understand. You have food, water, raw materials such as timber, but also cattail, also medicinal resources. And important here is that you can extract these ecosystem services directly from nature or for ecosystems and buy and sell them on the market. So you can pay an actual price for these ecosystem services. And also another important point is that these benefits, they usually accrue to private parties or to individuals. For example, if you own a forest, you own also the benefits coming from timber. Then in the bottom left, you have the regulating ecosystem services. They might be a bit more fuzzy. You can see there's air quality regulation, so filtering of air pollutants, climate regulation, capture of carbon, but also protection against storms or against tsunamis, erosion regulation, but also control against pests. And they are a bit more fuzzy because you cannot extract them directly from the market. So there's no direct place on the market, no direct price for them. And therefore they are often invisible and missing on balance sheets. Well, actually they are very important. And this is also partly what we will show today. The benefits accruing to the benefits of these ecosystem services, they accrue to broader communities and societies. For example, air pollutant filtering by forests, the benefits accrue to people that are living surrounding these forests. The same is the case for habitat ecosystem services and cultural ecosystem services, such as opportunities for recreation and tourism or spiritual experience. In a way, they have some characteristics of both. So they can accrue to private or public beneficiaries, and some can be sold on markets and others are a bit more indirect. It's important to note that when we are talking about ecosystem service valuation in the project, we are talking about monetary value or the economic importance of nature for our economies and societies. Monetary value on nature isn't necessarily the same as biodiversity. So it's important to know that they are connected, but it's also important to understand that they are distinct concepts. Ecosystem services can relate to the value for society and our economy, while biodiversity is more directly linked to a value for nature herself. I've mentioned it now a couple of times, but a prominent way to link nature to the economy is via the economic or monetary valuation of ecosystem services. And that basically places a monetary value in euros or dollars or any other currency on different types of ecosystem services. So if you can go to the next slide, monetary valuation is really a language to connect ecology to our economy. And it's a way to show the importance of ecosystem services, in this case of investments, in a language that we all understand. Ecologists can have a very different type of language or different types of concepts than someone who's working for financial institutions or vice versa. As you can see nicely in the picture on the left, but we need to understand each other and have a similar understanding of what our impacts on nature are. And one way of doing so is by placing an economic value on it. So we all more or less know the value of $1 or $1,000 or $1 million. So really to make it tangible and visible. Where we can translate our impacts on nature into relevant targets, policies, and by having a common language and a common understanding can really help doing so. Also, behind every ecosystem service, there's a beneficiary, and this is something which is inherent to the concept of ecosystem services, as it links natural systems with our societal systems. And this is also another reason why we think it's very useful to relate this concept to stakeholders, and we will also show that a bit later on. So what makes it very clear, what we will show you in the webinar today, is that we really need to redefine economic value, what it means to make the value of nature to our systems visible. And monetary valuation can make that link and thereby show how nature or how our economies are embedded within our societies and our societies within nature, and to all fit within the planetary boundaries, as you can see on the right. So if there's one thing that I hope that you can already take from this webinar, is that it should be that by undervaluing nature, we are not only ignoring the importance of nature for our own sake, but also ignoring it for the sake of our communities, our societies, and also for our investments. So it's time, I would think, to start incorporating the value of nature. So let's move to our first speaker. So having said this, we will now go to Roel Nozeman from the ASN Bank on the broader context of our collaboration and also the work that the ASN Bank has been doing in this field. Roel Nozeman is head of biodiversity at the ASN Bank, and he's program director of PBAF, the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials. He has a background in the financial and environmental sector, and he strives to bring these two worlds together and contribute to a sustainable future. And I think he's very much a piloting and leading professional in the field of integrating biodiversity in financial decision-making. And I really enjoy working with Roel because he feels very strongly about these topics, and he always wants to go that extra mile. And he will discuss the role of the ASN Bank in relation to biodiversity and ecosystem services, our collaboration on the project, and the link between ASN Bank and ecosystem services. And that all in about 10 minutes. Roel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vince, for your wonderful introduction and also your presentation before. And the cooperation is mutually really good and really nice. So let's start with that. No, thanks everybody for your attention and listening in. As Vince mentioned, this is piloting work. We haven't have all the answers at this moment. It's really starting, but I think it's really interesting and valuable work to do. So this part will be this part of the presentation will be done by Sietse de Jong, my colleague, who's the co-author of this Make Nature Count report, and I will do now a short introduction of how ecosystem services came to our attention and how it relates with our work on the topic of biodiversity, in which we have developed quite some work in the last years. So next slide, please. So ASN Bank, for who don't know the bank, it's a relative small green retail bank in the Netherlands, quite dark green, strict sustainability policies since our incorporation in 1960. Social issues were really first, but then the green topic came quickly after, and of course these two topics are really connected and should be connected, and also connected with climate change and other topics, of course. So these policies have sustainability policies, which is really the basis of why and how we invest, is just a start, or was just a start. But in 2014, we wanted to take a next step and also try to quantify our impact, and not only work with policies, but also try to measure impact, assess our impact as good as possible. And that's why we started exploring if we could get a footprint, a biodiversity footprint, similar to a carbon footprint, but then for biodiversity. And if we could pilot that for a financial institution, for a large portfolio of assets and investments, where often you don't know the location, sometimes you do know the location. That was really the beginning of this work globally, I think, and we really piloted with this methodology and and try to make sense of it and what we can use it for and for which we can't use it for. Now that was quite well accepted internally, led to more understanding of our relation and our impact on biodiversity. That's led to the setting of our long-term goal for biodiversity to have a net positive effect on biodiversity with our investments and loans by 2030. Really an audacious goal because this methodology was not there. We had to develop it, and also we had to find out which steps we needed to take in future. So something that not often is done, but we thought it was really important to do without having all the answers. We just start and pilot, and yeah, and that's also led to this project with FSD. Next slide, please. So if you look at some of the impact screening tools for biodiversity that we have used in the past, now this biodiversity footprinting you can see on the left, it's answering different questions, these tools. So this footprinting work answers the question where we can expect, because it's not, you can't go to the ground with footprinting, but which you can expect, where you can expect your largest impact in your portfolio and why, and once knowing that, it gives you an indication where you need to zoom in. And of course, there are other tools as well that can help you with answering that question. Where do we need to zoom in, and where can you find your largest impacts? The second one on the middle, the Encore knowledge base developed by UNW CMC, well known probably to a lot of you already. It's a qualitative indication of which ecosystem services companies and investors are dependent on, and if these dependencies are properly managed. So we have used this for one of our investment funds, looking at companies. And what was quite surprising for us is that there were a large number of companies in which we invested that are high or very high dependency in groundwater. That was something that we weren't aware of. And once you know that you have that information, you can zoom in and ask questions if these dependencies of these companies are really properly managed, or are there risks with those companies. And the Encore database is also used by the Dutch Central Bank in their landmark report from 2020, In Depth to Nature, and also by other central banks since then. And on the right side, the ESVD database is more recent work. It's really, yeah, going more to when you know the location of your investment, you can start using this scientific knowledge. The two initiatives on the left are an estimation of impact, but with the ESVD database and applying it to a location, you can get more scientific backing or information if you are moving in the right direction, if you're doing the right things, and if you are involving, for example, all the stakeholders that need to be involved, and if you should invest in any case in a certain project or not. So the location for this is really important. Can be used for impact investments, and we have done this for the ASN Biodiversity Fund that was developed by ASN Impact Investors, but there are more assets where you know the location and you can use this ESVD database. So these are 3 different lenses at which you could look at biodiversity and nature, and you can use them for the steps you want to take and to get more knowledge. Next slide, please. So Make Nature Count 2.0, the second report. So we have used this for the ASN Biodiversity Fund for two investments that has been done by the Biodiversity Fund. Sietse will explain more in detail the 2 different cases. That there were 3 objectives: measure the impact of land cover changes on ecosystem services. So what happens in those projects. Is there a land use change, for example, going from monoculture to regenerative agriculture, and yeah, what happens with these ecosystem services, which go up, which go down, and what's the valuation also of these changes, and also which stakeholders are affected. So that is one of the objectives of the project. Do that with for two of our projects. The second one, understand how we can use this knowledge on ecosystem services for our own policy making and decision making. And thirdly, fueling the discussion basically about what is economic value, how does nature fit in our economic system or doesn't fit in the economic system, and how should we use this knowledge to make better decisions and incorporating the value of nature in financial decision making. So three important objectives for this study. Next slide, please. So some insights. I think this is my last slide, so I won't be long anymore, Vince. There's an international context, of course. You have the Global Biodiversity Framework, COP15 last year, Montreal, the Paris Accord for Nature. Now, hopefully it will lead to that. But it also it really depends on the implementation of all the targets that are agreed upon by the countries. Target 15 is an important one, looking at and stating that large transnational corporations and financial institutions should measure their impact, dependencies, and risks on biodiversity by 2030. So all countries that are agreed upon this target, this DBF, should set up legislation to reach this target. Target 18 is about harmful incentives and subsidies. A lot of work is being done on countries on trying to see what are these incentives that are currently there and how to transform them, and by that decreasing their negative impact on nature and businesses. And target 19 is about mobilizing more finance for nature positive activities. It still needs to be defined exactly how that will work. There's a huge challenge, of course, with all these targets, but in general, ecosystem services can really play an important role in informing these targets and the realization of that. CSRD is European legislation, helping companies to understand their impacts and if they have a business model that has a future, if they are in line, operate in line or in balance with nature. That's what we need to go. That's where we need to go to. TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, launched their final recommendations in September last year. Also important in this respect, with impacts, risk, and opportunities. So I think a lot of developments that have a link with this work that's being done already for decades by scientists, and it's really important that we start using that science and get into the details that we need to get into, because it's not simple, this work. So I think I've said most of it. There's a big restoration challenge, of course. We are in the decade of restoration, so if you want to make sure we go into the right direction, we start looking at landscape level, at blended finance, now all linked with the things mentioned before. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention, and good luck, Sietse.
Thanks, Ulf, for laying the groundwork here. As you mentioned, we will move to the next part of the presentation, and very exciting, we will move to the actual content of the report, so what we have been doing. And I think that no one can explain that better than our second speaker, Sietse de Jong, Sustainability Advisor of the ASN Bank and first author of the report. And together we spent many, many hours on working out these cases. And I can tell that it was a real pleasure to work together with you, Sietse, your professional attitude, knowledge, but also sometimes your humor to power through, really. And in about 15 minutes, he will share the main insights of our collaboration. So Sietse, go ahead.
Thank you, Vince. I also really enjoyed our collaboration, as you know. As Vince said, I'm Sietse de Jong, and I'm going to tell you something about the report, take you through the insights. If you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, before we dive into really the content, I will quickly take you through the methodology we applied in this report. It basically consists of 4 different steps. The first one being understanding the context. So where is the project located? What are the relevant ecosystems? Who are the stakeholders? And the idea is to get as much detail about the project as possible. The second step being the collecting of relevant data using the ecosystem services valuation database, which I'll explain something about in the next slide, and other sources, for example, other scientific literature or data that can be acquired by local actors. The third step being the calculation of standardized values. So extracting these values from the database and standardizing these values in order to do the calculations, which consist of step 4, the calculation of the total economic value and the net present value. So this is the last step where we really calculated the monetary value of the changes in ecosystem services. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the ecosystem service valuation database, I briefly mentioned it. It is the largest publicly available database with almost 10,000 data points and values for all ecosystems and services on all continents. And these values are gathered from more than 30 to 40 years of ecosystem services research. And about 71% of the values are currently standardized. Standardization is really important because this allows us to look at an aggregated level and apply the values to other cases, which of course needs to be done very carefully. And in order for the control of the values, it is the legitimacy. 50% of the values are currently have been externally reviewed, and this is still increasing. And of these almost 10,000 values, these come from more than 1,300 reports, and even more are on the way. If you go to the next slide, please. Yes. So as you probably know, at least if you've read the report, we've looked at 2 different investment cases of the ASN Biodiversity Fund. The first one being a farm in Spain, which is transitioning from conventional to organic farming. And in this transitioning, there's also different new crops that are being planted, some crops that were already there and staying there, but the new crops are starting production and reaching maturity, and thereby maturity level yields in different years. And besides this transition, this also involved the complete restoration of natural land at the farm. We assumed this to be complete after 10 years, and this to happen linearly, so by 10% per year. And it's also very important to mention that we assumed the provisioning of ecosystem services to be linearly correlated with the restoration of this natural land. So, for example, if 50% of the land was restored, this means that 50% of the ecosystem services were provided. And for this case, we used a lot of locally specific data for most ecosystem services, and this was complemented by values from the ESVD. Next slide, please. The second case, which is about the Reforestera project in Brazil. This involves the reforestation of 2,000 hectares of degraded pasture lands in the southern Amazon in Brazil. It also involves the payment of 600 landholders via payment for ecosystem services schemes. This is a really important part of the project, but this is something we did not take into account in the project because we solely focused on ecosystem services and the provision of it. For this case, we assume that the reforestation takes 20 years and also happens linearly. And again, provisioning of ecosystem services is assumed to be linearly correlated with the reforestation. And for this case, we mainly used ESVD data and some locally provided data. Next slide, please. Yeah, so because of time constraints, I will not go in detail for all the information in the report. Therefore, I highly recommend you to read the report, but we'll go through it by means of the conclusions and recommendations. So the report, there are basically two main conclusions. The first one being that ecosystem services valuation provides a clear language for due diligence efforts and pinpoints the way in needed stakeholder engagement. And if you can go to the next slide. Yes. So as I mentioned, we calculated total economic value and a net present value for both cases. And the total economic value is actually the total bundle, the value of the total bundle of ecosystem services for a particular area per year. So as you can see here in this table, this is the total economic value of the farm in 1 year. And as you can see on the bottom of the table, we calculated that the total economic value of the farm increases by 1.2 million, which is an increase of about 70%. However, it is important to be aware that in the calculation of the total economic value, we assumed so-called full potential, meaning that we assumed that all the crops have reached maturity level yields, and thereby this also applies to the national areas. So we assume these to be fully restored. This is very important to be aware of because this, of course, takes time. But as you can also see is that all the different ecosystem service categories increase. So the provisioning, the regulating, the habitat, and the cultural. And if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, we can see that this is also the case for the investment case in Brazil. So here the total economic value increases by 7.6 million, which is an astonishing 1200% increase. And here again, also the all different categories increase. So why is ecosystem service valuation and analysis important or can help in stakeholder engagement? As you can see here with the table, you can split out all the different ecosystems, and you can find out and actually relate different stakeholders to certain ecosystem services. And as you can see, you can determine whether an ecosystem service increases or decreases in value. And in that way, you can also see what are the stakeholders that are that experience the effects of this increase and decrease. And you can then incorporate this knowledge into your stakeholder engagement. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so we move to the second conclusion. The second conclusion is that ecosystem service valuation is key to determine the most effective mitigation strategies. If you can go to the next slide. Yes, this relates to the mitigation hierarchy, which is shown on this sheet. As you can see, this consists of 4 different steps. The first step being the avoidance of negative impact. The second step, the minimization of negative impact. The third step, the restoration of nature and biodiversity, and the fourth step being the offset of any residual negative impact and sometimes even a contribution leading to a net gain. So understanding the impact via ecosystem services, benefits and losses provides entry points in finding the most suitable mitigation strategy. So by looking at the results of an analysis provides insights into seeing where your project fits in the mitigation hierarchy. For example, in both cases involved step 3, the restore step, where the restoration of national areas takes place. But also the case in Spain fits with step 1 and 2, which relates to avoid and minimize because of the transition to organic agriculture and using of different crop systems. So an ecosystem services approach can place management decisions or regulations into perspective of the mitigation hierarchy, and it can help in assessing the effectiveness of different mitigation steps by showing the impact on ecosystems. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So the report also provides 3 recommendations. The first one being that we need to recognize the value of regulating ecosystem services. Next slide, please. Yes. As you could see in the table I just showed you, but also this table makes it very clear, you can see that all different ecosystem service categories increase in value. The regulating ecosystem services accounting for the largest relative increase in these services. And as Vince already explained earlier, most of the regulating services have a non-market type of value, meaning that these services, these benefits, they're not being traded on markets, and therefore they're also often neglected in the more traditional economic and finance mechanisms. However, these regulating services often benefit the public. Think about erosion prevention, removal of air pollutions, waste treatment, biological control, pollination, etc. And these are often also, they make sure that the whole ecosystem is healthy and the other services can be provided. And by attaching a monetary value and showing that these regulating services, even though they are currently not being valued, they have a real value. So we can visualize otherwise invisible values. And in order for projects, nature positive projects, for example, restoration projects, it is very important that mechanisms such as planet finance, where private and public finance is combined, are being developed, but also mechanisms such as payment for ecosystem services is critical. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the second recommendation is that we need to align our time horizons with nature. So next slide. This is can be shown by an example from the first case, or the farm in Spain. As I mentioned earlier, we calculated a net present value, which is actually a net value, a present value of all the future benefits and losses discounted to a net present value using a discount rate. So for this case, we use a time horizon of 20 years and a discount rate of 5%. And it's important to be aware that in calculating the net present value, we solely looked at the ecosystem services. So we did not take the value of the land into account, for example, which is also a very important part of the investment. But as you can see here, over a time horizon of 20 years, the net present value of the ecosystem service in a conventional agricultural scenario are still higher than the organic agriculture scenario. Only after 18 years, the value of the ecosystem services in the organic scenario surpasses the value of the ecosystem service in the conventional scenario. So this shows that investing in nature takes quite some time, and it's therefore important to use longer time horizons to be able to show the full potential nature has. But in the more conventional, traditional economics and finance, shorter time horizons are often being used. So when you're investing in nature, it's really important to use longer time horizons to see the full potential of investing in nature. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then the last recommendation is that we need to reconsider our discount rates based on land use. Next slide. So in the first case in Spain, we changed the discount rates to account for ecological dynamics. The rationale behind this is because, for example, different forms of capital, human capital, natural capital, can require different discount rates. Exactly when you're investing in nature, which is restoring and takes time. If nature is increasing over time, why would you use a positive discount rate that actually depreciates the value of nature that you aim to obtain in the coming years? So we used three scenarios here to analyze this. As you can see, the left two columns where we used a uniform discount rate of 5% from both scenarios. The middle two columns where we used a 5% discount rate for the ecosystem services obtained from the agricultural production and a 0% discount rate for the ecosystem services for that were related to the national areas. And the right two columns where we used a 5% discount rate for the conventional agricultural and a 0% for organic agriculture. And the rationale behind this is that the transition to organic agriculture is likely to have a positive effect on the landscape. So the quality of the land is increasing and therefore also has a higher ability to produce healthy crops, whereas with conventional agricultural, especially in the case where this farm is located, conventional agriculture can actually lead to a degradation of the land and therefore reducing the ability of the land to produce healthy crops and thereby diminishing value. So this shows that we need to align the discount rates with the actual ecological value development within the land use. So if we are restoring land, you might actually need to use a different discount rate when as compared to using conventional practices. Next slide, please. So an overview, two main conclusions of the report, that ecosystem service valuation provides clear language for due diligence efforts, pinpoints the way in needed stakeholder engagement, and ecosystem service valuation is key to determine most effective mitigation strategies. And furthermore, the three recommendations that we need to recognize the value of regulating ecosystem services, we need to align our time horizons with nature, and that we need to reconsider our discount rates based on land use. This is in really short an overview of the results of the report. And as I mentioned before, I highly encourage you to read the report to get more detail about about why we did this, what did we do, and how did we do it. But for now, this was it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sietse, for enlightening us on the actual practical work in the project. I think it's good if everybody at least recognizes or remembers these two conclusions and three recommendations. And because we're a bit on a strict time limit, I think I will, we had a bit of a delay. I will skip the Mentimeter for now, maybe do it later. We saw some questions and comments coming in, so that's very nice. So please continue and we will address them all later. And now we will continue with our second part of the webinar, a bit more the interactive part, starting with a 15-minute conversation between Caroline van Leenders and Karin van Dijk on the use of monetary valuation data for financial institutions. And they're both experts in the field of biodiversity and ecosystem services in relation to financial institutions, but they're working at it or they're approaching it from very different perspectives. Karin van Dijk is creator and fund manager of the ASN Biodiversity Fund, the fund that worldwide focuses on business models operating in balance, aiming to operate in balance with nature and biodiversity. And targets for the fund are set up in financial return, but also focusing on biodiversity return and also on green jobs. And Karin and I, we have known each other for a short time, but Karin can, I think, based on her experience in the field, really bridge what is happening and needed on the ground with these broader frameworks to measure impact, such as the thing that we have been doing in this project. Caroline van Leenders is Senior Process Manager at the Dutch Enterprise Agency and also affiliated to the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Safety. She's co-founder of the TNFD and was part of the COP15. And we as FSD have worked together with Caroline on various projects several times. She's very well known in the field of greening the financial sector, really looking at it from the spirit of co-creation and connection, I would say. And a while back when we had dinner, Caroline, some others and I, we had the idea to write a little book to stimulate and integrate nature metaphors into daily life instead of other types of metaphors. And to give a simple example, we don't want to speak about roadmaps, which are based on concrete built environment for cars. They are directional. What we want to speak about pathways, having more of a vision, kind of curvy, and being more in nature. And as Caroline also knows, language matters in our shift to a new paradigm for nature. So please, Karin and Caroline, go ahead.
Well, hello all, and thank you for these kind words for the possibility to put an interactive part in this webinar before we, of course, move to the very interactive panel with the Q&A. Karin, great to speak to you. I think it is congratulations with the report as ASN Bank, but also it being used on two cases of the biodiversity fund that it was said before. The first one that under market conditions is set up by the ASN Bank. There was already a little bit said about the two cases that were used for this study, but maybe you could add some extra information if you want to for the audience. What are relevant things for us to know about the two cases that were used for this study to come to the conclusions that were just presented by your colleague Sietse de Jong. So maybe you can give us a little extra context.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Caroline. Let me give you a bit more of the investor perspective on both cases. I work at the ASN Biodiversity Fund, which is the fund of the ASN impact investors, and we invest in projects around the world that have a positive impact on biodiversity. We focus on 4 sectors: sustainable forestry, regenerative agroforestry, sustainable seas and fisheries, and ecotourism. And all potential investments have in common that they are building an economy economy in balance with nature. And that's what you also see in both investment cases that are used in this research. The first one is from the SLM Silva Europe's fund, the El Roble farm in Spain, and it's really about organic production business moving to regenerative agriculture. And the benefits of these types of productions are enormous. They grow a wide variety of crops that allow the soil to recover. They focus on producing without expensive pesticides. This reduces their cost, while they are aimed to sell at higher prices. So they're really focusing on running a smart and profitable business while restoring biodiversity. And these are the investments I looked for, or I select for the ASN Biodiversity Fund. And the other investment in the Amazon that was researched is part of the Amazon Biodiversity Fund that we invest in. And they focus both on sustainable forestry and on sustainable agroforestry with a number of different investments. And what all these investments have in common is that it's their mission to protect and restore the Amazon. So through this fund, we invest in companies in the area that are making, for instance, products from fruit and herbs that are originally grown in the Amazon area. And in that way, maintains the balance in the area. So again, when we invest, we look from both a biodiversity and a financial perspective.
Okay, thanks. Well, there were already for both cases some ecosystems, regulating ecosystem services that were valued that we maybe normally not value, and the great numbers, new numbers were derived. Maybe as a little extra question was on one of the things that I understand is that the farm in Spain, by the way, there's a lot less erosion. This might be an ecosystem service, stopping erosion, that normally is not valued, but of course has a big value in itself. So are there any other, outcomes of this study that at least surprised you in these two cases, in one of these two cases, that ecosystem service that you thought, yes, great, that they now get more attention. Now we get a better insight of their value.
Yeah, well, let me compare it to how we normally measure impact on biodiversity. Like we are calculating the amount of hectares we restore, or we look on how flora and fauna is evolving. But with this research, we can now also put a price tag on the development of ecosystem services. And that's really great. And it gives us a far more understanding of the potential impact of an investment on the ecosystem services, and putting the economic value of these services especially to society and local stakeholders. So what we see is while the concept of ecosystem services might have some limitations, it really provides a language that is essential in our transition to a nature positive economy. And it expresses the impact on nature in terms we can understand, revealing both the risks, like you mentioned with soil erosions, but also the opportunities. So it really gives us insights in how we should develop pathways to economies that operate in harmony within planetary boundaries. And it actually proves that ecosystem services are worth investing in. And what we see in both cases is that putting a monetary value on the ecosystem services provided by a more sustainable or multifunctional land use provides important insight in the so-called true returns of the landscape restoration. So we really make visible what was invisible before, the value of nature. And the results show that the investments have a positive impact on a wide range of ecosystem services and the health of the existing ecosystems. So by restoring the natural areas, you see an increase in the provision of regulating habitat and cultural ecosystem services, and projected to increase the general social welfare. So it's really demonstrating that, for instance, in Spain, that the transition to organic farming pays off in the long run. And what Sietse already mentioned is that you have more insight in the public non-market type of ecosystem services. And I think that's a very important part, because what we already know in our investment philosophy is that really important to involve local communities when restoring nature. We cannot invest in nature without local communities. And this research really further demonstrates the added value to local communities. So that's that the surface become more visible. And at the other side, what you mentioned about the soil erosion in Spain, on this farm or in this area, the land has been degraded for many years. So if you continue in this way, the soils are completely going to be exhausted. And this research can also help to calculate, if you do not make the transition, what the losses will be. So for an investor, it really helps to make better choices. So going back to what we do as a fund, we really focus on sustainable business in balance with nature and biodiversity. And knowing the value of ecosystem services is increasing, it helps us to show that we're on the right pathway. So that, yeah, it's really valuable for us.
Yeah, thank you. Well, of course, in the financial sector, in the broader financial sector, more and more attention is given to risk. We have the Task Force Nature-related Financial Disclosure. Regulation is coming from the EU, already started with the CSRD, but also regulation on due diligence. Your colleague already said that this kind of calculations can also help you to do the steps in the due diligence. On the other hand, it's not enough to look at risk. We also have to look at opportunities. In the Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed on in Montreal at COP15, there's also attention for a target for innovative finance, payment for ecosystem services. So could you maybe, in a bit of a broader sense, give the audience an idea how the monetary value of regulating ecosystem services can be beneficial to make the next step of not only looking at risk, but getting more attention for mitigation of risk and looking at opportunities also for the broader financial sector. Maybe elaborate a little bit on that, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, for investors, I notice it's very helpful that you express the added value in euros. It makes the monetary value of investing in an economy that's in balance with nature more tangible. And let me start with the risks, of course, that's the language we speak first. What we see in the last years is that monoculture versus regenerative agriculture has worked very well for a very long time. But over the last 50 years, the soil was been degraded due to this type of production, and we're now at a point that it has run out or starting to run out, and investors should really take this huge risk into account. If I go back to the case in southern Spain, for instance, when we drove to the farm, all we saw around us was monoculture citrus plantations, which is really strange because the area has extreme droughts and a lot of water shortage. And this crop is very water intensive, and the monoculture is further depleting the soil. So if you're an investor and you're going to invest in monoculture, you should consider the decreasing the decreasing value of the land and the effect it will have on the production in the near future. And what we already mentioned, the risk of erosion increases due to the production method. So if you're valuing ecosystem services, it can really help investor understand these risks in monetary value and incorporate them in decision making to, well, actually consider a more holistic business case assessment. But at the same time, I think it's even more important that investors should focus on is understanding the opportunity, what we can reach by restoring ecosystem services. What we see with the research is that the value of the land will increase, and this could be reflected in higher exit value, for instance, in the future. Sietse already mentioned it. What we normally see is that the value of the land will decrease, or you have to write off the value of the land. But with this research, it shows is that if you restore biodiversity, you will increase the value of the land over time. And if you can put a monetary value on the added value of a project for nature, we can really include it in the assessment of the investment. And I agree with Sietse, we really would like to use this methodology during due diligence, because it helps us even further to identify the projects that will contribute to biodiversity, and it provides more insights into potential sustainability risks. And by using this assessment method, we can, well, improve the chance of success and reduce or mitigate sustainability risks.
Well, thank you. I think we are all, the whole world is looking for, methods and paradigms to come to more nature positive pathways. So great if that could be a part of that big puzzle. Maybe one last question, Vince, before we go to the other interactive part, because I do have one other question, which of course is about time. Everybody knows financial sector, short term, not saying that every financial actor is only looking at short-term gain, but that's a bit how the sector works. If we want to relate to nature, we also have to think about the time nature needs. So could you maybe say a little bit extra on the factor of time and how does the ASN Bank hopes to get a sector that's a bit more long-term, takes a longer-term perspective that is needed for these very important services to restore?
Yeah, well, the calculation really clearly showed that investor nature always takes time, precisely because it's all about growth, and you won't get the full revenue of the ecosystem services if you're looking just for a few years at an investment. But that's really part of investing in biodiversity, really taking this longer term view. We are educating our investors about this, and we're engaging a lot with financial institutions to tell about the longer term you need for nature. But back to the positive business case for investing in nature, it's essential that we invest in healthy business cases if we want to restore biodiversity for the long term. And what we see in these two investment cases in the research is that they both already work towards a solid financial return. But if we value the ecosystem services, it shows that there is even more added value in the long run in the value of the land because of the restoration of biodiversity. And this could really be translated, for instance, in a higher exit value in the future. But it may also prove that to be what makes investors stay in a case. And that's really a long-term commitment we need. And with the research, we're really making visible what was invisible before, the value of nature expressed in money. After all, money is the language everyone understands.
Well, at least in the financial sector. Thank you very much. Maybe 20 years, and if it goes faster, you are a lucky one. Is that kind of our general consensus that we might have at the moment? Trying to persuade everybody to also take a different perspective on time, maybe. Well, thank you very much, Karin. Thank you, Vince. Back to you for the next part of this webinar, I suppose.
Yeah. Thank you both for your insights. Indeed, make visible what is invisible, and language is money is the language that that everybody understands, or that a lot of people understand, especially in the financial sector. And what I hope is that this sparks some imagination on how you can use this actually on a project level, and also how you can make the business case. And what I really liked was the example that you gave, Karin, on this monocultures versus organic agriculture, and how you can actually use our data to show the differences and the importance of these type of assessments. Now we will shortly go to Roel again for some collaborative opportunities. I don't think this will take so much time, and then we will go to the Q&A session. We saw that there were already questions and comments, so we will address these later. But first, shortly to Roel, and then to the Q&A.
Yep. Okay, Vince, thank you very much. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'll keep this really short. Like I said before, really pioneering work this. We're not done yet by far. So if you're interested in collaborating with us, that is one of the organizations or all of them that are involved in this, please let us know. One of the opportunities is to work with the PBAF Working Group on Ecosystem Services. It's funded by the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality, Food Safety. This work, of course, at this moment, it's still involving quite some manual work. We have to be honest with this, but it reminded me of footprinting in the beginning years. Also, a lot of manual work, and that quickly changed and became automized and easier to use for the financial sector. So I'm really positive that it will happen also with this knowledge and work. So that's if you want to contribute to that, please contact PBAF. myself for Wijnand. Second opportunity is to become a member of the ESP network. Use the scientific knowledge and cooperate with that network is really valuable. Large network, a lot of knowledge globally on this topic. And of course, there could be also other ideas, brainstorming opportunities that you can think of. So please contact or Vince or Mieke or any of us, and let's try to make nature count and work on this topic further. Thank you.
Thanks, Roel, for the collaborative opportunities. Now we will go to the Q&A session. This will be interactive. During the Q&A, we will give people who actually have questions, and there were already posed some questions in the chat or in the Q&A section, to give the floor. So what I would suggest to do is that if you have a question or comment, also the one that you've already posed, to voice it. And then we can give you the opportunity to speak and voice a question, and then we, as a panel, will answer. As you can see now on the screen, these are the panelists for today, except from Mieke, who is there in the background, but she's not able to join because of illness. And Caroline was very last minute able to join, so that's very nice. Thank you, Caroline, for being here. And if you do not feel comfortable with asking questions, we have the chat here also, so I can pose questions to some of the panelists. So I would say if you have a question or a comment, please raise your hand and I will give you the floor. And then we can move on from there. And otherwise, I will start with the questions as they were posted in the chat. Yeah, it's always brave to take the first step. So Vincent, you raised your hand. So please go ahead if you are able to unmute yourself, and otherwise we will unmute you.
Yes, thank you. I had a question that I also posted in the chat, so that doesn't have to be addressed then anymore. I was wondering about the monetization approach, because I can imagine that there's many different ways of monetizing the ecosystem service, or one single ecosystem service, depending on what type of costs you take into account and whether you take a more private approach or public approach. So, for example, I was giving also in the chat the example of erosion, whether you look at it from whether that has an effect on the provisioning services, lower yields because you lost nutrients, or whether you look at it from in terms of mud streams and therefore causing a lot of damage costs for public, which are public costs. So I'm wondering which type of approach is chosen, and is this also being done consistent within the different ecosystem services? Because in the end, of course, you're summing all those costs, and I can imagine that it is very challenging to have a sort of consistent approach in this. So I wonder how you dealt with it. Yeah, so maybe you can talk a bit more about how that has been done.
Yeah, so thanks for the comment and the question. I think they're both very relevant. Maybe I should be the first one to answer this, and if there's any other comments, please follow up. Yeah, so you mentioned the different approaches that we use also specifically in this project. So we used here both the ECD, and the ECD is a collection of these studies. So what we did here is we have multiple data points, for example, for soil erosion, for Mediterranean wood and shrubland, because we need to connect the ecosystem to the ecosystem surface. So what we did there is we took an average of these values if needed. So in this case, we also looked for, especially in Spain, we also had very local specific data from research that was done there. So we had a lot of research papers, or we looked for a lot of research papers which were doing research in similar areas as we see in the case in Spain. And that was most of the data that we used in this case. So there we can say that data is quite location specific, but it's also indeed, especially for the second case in Brazil, that we use quite a lot of aggregated data with different types of approaches which are kind of combined. So we had a lot of data, for example, on the removal of air pollutants or of carbon sequestration, and we use an average value of that data. And that's also one of the considerations for And for next steps, this was really kind of piloting very this is used to show kind of the order of magnitude or the importance of nature or of ecosystems to us for all these different ecosystem services. But next steps would indeed be to make this more specific. But since every case is always a bit different, it's also very difficult to find exact literature, for example, that matches that specific case study or that specific policy side. So there we have to level a bit in using kind of a broader data, which is a bit more general, and using much more specific data based on the ecosystem service, but also the valuation methodologies which you can choose from, because there's many different valuation methodologies to come to this total economic value. There's one way that we are looking at it to improve this is via value transfer functions, which is kind of a scientific development where, based on our database, where we have a lot of data for specific ecosystem services and using contextual data. So use data on the condition of an ecosystem, use data on GDP, use data on proximity to an ecosystem to kind of get a better estimate or a more precise estimate for a specific location.
Yeah, because as I understand now from your answer, it's also not possible to compare the two case studies and say, for example, the case study in Brazil has lower biodiversity impact, so we want to learn or maybe invest more in that, and we stop investing, for example, in the one in Spain because it had higher biodiversity impact. You cannot compare those exactly based on the numbers that you calculated, right?
Yeah, so what we try to do is, also what we tried to mention before, is that we see ecosystem services and the monetary valuation of ecosystem services as different from biodiversity. As they are connected, but they are different concepts. And here we're speaking really about the added benefits towards economies and the added benefits towards societies. So in that way, I think it's different from biodiversity, and also in comparing, we're comparing kind of organic agriculture with reforestation, so with a forest. And those are in that way also a bit difficult to place together, as they are very different contexts. But within one investment, if you compare degraded shrublands versus reforestation, there you have two scenarios which you can compare. But I think in this case it would be difficult to compare both scenarios, as they are completely or both different cases, as they are completely different.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone has anything else to add to this? All right, then there is another hand up. I think it's Sander.
Yeah, hi.
Sander Keulen, hello.
Yes. Hi. Also posted my question in the chat. So for clarification, I would love to know if there's an opportunity to refine the model and actually get a more accurate assessment of your ecosystem using eDNA testing. So for example, you find some degraded land, doing eDNA testing on the plot itself, kind of get a good profile of what the soil looks like and what the condition is, and then you restore it, and after 5 years or 10 years, you repeat the cycle, and you actually can create a very nice delta. And in that delta, of course, there's value. And so wondering if that could actually be add on top of your model, where you can more substantiate the current system, the state of the ecosystem, but also maybe a potential future state. If you look at the environment around it, you can actually then assess, okay, so this is the delta we need to achieve.
Shall I respond to this? Yeah. Nick Oakes, you are in the call as well, aren't you? I hope I don't surprise you. Nick is from Impact Earth, from the Amazon Biodiversity Fund, and you're working with eDNA. So I thought it might be interesting if you could elaborate a bit what you're already doing with eDNA, and maybe one of the project team can tell more how we can integrate it into the research.
Quickly, I'm looking for Nick in the chat, but I don't see him.
Okay, maybe he left the call. I saw him in the beginning. Yeah. What they are doing in Brazil, we visited them as well, and what they are doing work together with an NGO. They developed a tool that they started with a baseline and they take samples of the soil to collect the eDNA, and they're training the farmers or the local people to repeat this every year or every other year. And then they can take the samples themselves and send them to the lab and collect the data. So that's really something they are working with. And I'm also interested if that could be translated in ecosystem services value. I'm not quite sure, Vince or Sietse, if you can comment on that.
Sietse, is there anything you would like to add? Otherwise, I can.
Yeah, I think as Karin just said, like by getting the most information about your project is of course very helpful, because this is also something we encountered in our project. Because of course you're doing a project and you of course would like as much data as possible, and especially such specific data as you just mentioned, Sander. But this was of course now not really possible. But I definitely think that such information and data is helpful. And as I also said in my presentation, the more data and information you have about your case, the more specific and detailed will be your outcome.
Yeah. Hopefully, does that answer your question a bit, Sander?
Yes, it does. Yeah. Sure does for now. Absolutely. Thanks.
All right. Thank you for your question. Then I see a hand up from Philip Andreas.
Yes, I unmuted myself. Thank you. I'm Philip Andres from Perimeter Forest Limited Partnership. We're a Canadian-based forest carbon offset company holding about 380-some thousand acres of forest across Canada. And my questions really relate to a certain level of frustration we have that currently there's a trend towards removal credits, both technology-based removal credits and nature-based removal credits, and which kind of subrogates the value that primary and intact forests can make in providing reservoirs for maintaining biodiversity and assisting in infilling degraded adjacent areas. So that trend really makes it difficult for entities that hold primary forests to derive value from them. Putting a value on biodiversity would fix that problem. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are in terms of the efforts you're making to actually help change that. Because without intact primary forests and actually renaturalizing commercial forests, we are losing the biodiversity we are relying on for a healthy economy. So I would like to get your input. I have a second question afterwards. So.
Great, thanks for your question. Maybe Roel or Caroline wanted to start?
If you want to go, Caroline, or otherwise.
I think you can start, Roel, please. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think you're raising a really important point, Philip, about intact forest landscapes and intact forest within, for example, FSC or other certifications. There is a lot of attention. They're really important. But if you only look at the carbon lens, like you mentioned, with the carbon credits, then there's no incentive to maintain those areas and protect them. So I think it's really important to see if we can influence and help entities and investors like you to also be incentivized to do that. There's a lot of developments, and we're not totally sure where it's going on the field of biodiversity credits, which is the question how big that market will be and how this will turn out and what's needed to develop those credits, and if there's companies that are willing to pay. So I think in general there are a lot of developments in this, but yeah, if you have ideas how we can we don't influence the legislation or not directly, but of course by the work we do, we indirectly we show what's possible, and this is a point that's really important, and we haven't addressed it before. So maybe Caroline, you can add, or Philip.
Yeah. We our idea is as an example to combine carbon offset credits from improved forest management on our properties with what we call area-based nature units. So you would actually combine, you would look at the crediting period. In our case, we do look at a crediting period in the voluntary market over 100 years. And then we would calculate, in essence, the total number of credits that we're projecting to be issued over that 100-year period. And each year when we issue carbon credits for that year, we would protect an equivalent percentage as a total of the total credits that will be issued over that 100-year period, and assign a certain portion of the land, the number of hectares, to those credits and preserve them for a minimum of 100 years, meaning that we put a conservation easement on that land, and then that would preserve that land for a minimum of 100 years. We could also look at perpetual preservation, and that would kind of bring it closer to the marketplace and show that actually it's not just about carbon offset credits, but it's also about long-term protection and conservation of those lands. So that's kind of one way for us to look at it, and we call that area-based nature units. And I don't know what you think about it, but it's we kind of test market this a little bit and see what people think about it, and we would encourage feedback, and I would encourage you to tell us what you think of the concept.
Yeah, my suggestion then would be to contact each other after this call and involve different parties.
Okay, that would be great. And I guess the second question I posted, and then
maybe Caroline
you
had
go
a
ahead,
comment on
Caroline.
Yeah, now only little thing to add. We think as a Dutch government Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality, that it is really important to get a good position on biocredits, the safeguards that are needed for a market for biocredits. We are not there yet. We are in discussions also on EU level, but we hope that we will have a position on that during this year. On the other hand, I've written a little paper, and it will be published one of these days, where we pose the idea that to call production nature inclusive, you should at least work on a positive way for 3 regulating ecosystem services to avoid the whole problem that you get perverse effects if you do only one, if you do only carbon or only water or only this or only that. That's one of the biggest problems of our economies, the way we've built them. To make things more holistic and more integrated, we would propose that you should at least work on a positive way for 3 regulating ecosystem services, which makes it a way to think about how things can be combined and how you can, and maybe land and maybe water or use ecosystems. So that's just an idea to see how we can get maybe also a definition for what is nature positive, bringing it more to a holistic perspective than only valuing one ecosystem service like carbon. So that's maybe just a short reflection.
Okay, well, that's kind of going in the direction we're thinking of, right?
That's good to hear, Philip. Maybe just as a very short, we are very focusing on these regulating ecosystem services, and these regulating ecosystem services, maybe also the approach that you can take to show the value of your forest to a much broader audience, to communities surrounding, but also even to global communities. So that's maybe an approach that you could consider, and that we could also discuss in a later stage. I see that there are still some questions. So Philip, if it's okay, if your second question, if you can post in the chat, we will answer all the questions in the chat and all the comments later, also on the email, for everybody who did not have their questions answered. But I see Pavel has his hand up. So if we could go on for about 2 or 3 more minutes before we go to the closing, because it is very important to have this interaction going. So Pavel, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the presentations today. I'm Pavel, I'm a master's student at Leiden University, and my question is so a bit of a context. The European Parliament recently voted, I think it was November, against a proposal law aimed at significantly reducing the use of chemical pesticides in the EU. And as we've heard today, the narrative around organic agriculture often includes this arguments of lower impact on ecosystems and reduced health risks. However, the Parliament's decision might suggest a different perspective, indicating that the perceived environmental and health benefits do not outweigh, for them at least, the potential drawbacks in terms of food production and economic impact. So my question is, how do you, in light of all of these political fluctuations, how do you adapt your investments? How do you adapt to this? And or do you at all? Thank you.
Thanks, Pavel. I think this is very relevant, very well posed question. I would again maybe have Caroline and Roel, maybe also Karin. Any of you?
Yeah, Karin, you can sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And then
Yeah,
Caroline.
shall I start? Like, we have our
Yeah.
own investment criteria. We work open source, so we publish our sustainability policy and investment criteria on our website. And in our criteria, we say, okay, we don't invest in projects that use pesticides. So in this specific case, we're not influenced by any political decision, because we see that there is enough scientific research which shows the damage of pesticides. So we ask our projects, or we select our projects based on these sustainability criteria. And what I like about the projects we are doing is that they are really showcasing how they can produce similar crops, but with a value for nature and without harming inputs like pesticides. So as a consumer, if you have the choice between two products, then the choice should be easier to make. So that's really a transition we hope to encourage in the economy and in projects. Maybe Caroline or Roel, you want to add from a political perspective?
Yeah, I think maybe if Caroline can add, and then there's one other hand up, and then it's also time for closing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm a civil servant, so, I'm not a politician, but we are very depending on politicians, of course, in our democracies. Well, one of the things that I think that is really helpful is the role that central banks are taking at the moment, and financial regulators. They will become increasingly important also in these kind of discussions. You see them moving on risk, financial risk due to biodiversity loss, with all the reports they published, and even the European Central Bank coming out with reports on how dependent we are on nature. My discussions with the Dutch dialogues with the Dutch Central Bank shows that these financial regulators are also becoming more and more interested to think about, but what to invest in then. And they also have a mandate to give long-term economic advice to governments, which not always happens in political cycles, because they are 4 years, and as we've seen, we need longer term. So I'm hoping, and it was also one of the questions, we are very much in contact, and it's also for the ASN Bank and other front runners in this field. We are also working closely with those kind of financial actors, in the hope that with their longer perspective, that they can help convince politicians that it is worthwhile to move the paradigm to a more regenerative and nature positive economy.
Thank you, Caroline. I think I hope that answers the question. Then I see Victor Smith has his hand up. Maybe that could be the final question. Then we go to the closing.
Yes, thank you, Vince, and thank you, all of you, actually, for this very comprehensive report. I actually work at the central bank, so I got your point there, Caroline. But I'll skip my first question about what central banks and regulators should do. So if you take more of an investment or an investor's perspective, of course, I realize you've done this on a project basis, but I was wondering if you also look at ecosystem service valuation. Have you already tried looking at that from a more company level perspective? So if you invest in equities, for example, or is your current methodology that you've described that also requires a lot of data is not viable for those kinds of assessments?
Yeah, very good point also, Victor. Maybe I can start, and then if someone wants to add. Yeah, for now, this is really, I think that's also partly the strength of this type of valuation, or of ecosystem service valuation, is that you have location information, that you have project level information, actual, in our case, even land cover change. because changing from one land cover to another one can give you information on 2 land covers and their ecosystem services. And those are very easily relatable to ecosystem service. Well, if you move, for example, to listed equity, I can imagine that it will be a bit more fuzzy and a bit more difficult to attribute changes or to attribute an investment to actual to the listed equity. So I think in that case it's a bit more difficult. And it's of course broader applicable than what we've done now, but I think in terms of giving a very locally specific information on impact assessment, this is the first step.
And maybe to add very little thing, of course the TNFD framework came out, and one of the first things is location. So the time is coming. The companies, bigger companies, but also financials, are asked to report on location. So I think it's only a matter of time. Well, it cannot be fast enough, to my opinion, but maybe opinions in that, differ. But I think the whole point that we have an economic system where production is not longer of knowledge, and there's no transparency on our location of production, that will be something of the past, coming up with these new frameworks. So that might be a stimulus also to work with this kind of data and this kind of valuation.
If no one has anything to add, then I think this is a great final comment, Caroline. Let's move to the closing. We have 2 more minutes. I will keep it very short. As I mentioned, but to stress again, we will answer all your questions and comments also via email. So we will get back to you. I hope that in the past hour and 28 minutes, we have been able to enlighten you. And we hope that this webinar has given you more information on, well, actually the need to redefine economic value, and what we have been doing together with the ASN Bank on a very practical level, and how you can use monetary valuation and how monetary valuation is seen in a bit more broader context and international development, such as the TNFD, but also the Global Biodiversity Framework, which also mentions ecosystem services. And I think if there's 2 things that you should take from this webinar and from nature at large, it's that we must reason and think from the perspective of nature to really align decision-making and our economies with environmental sustainability and planetary boundaries, and not vice versa. It's really not possible to put a square peg in a circular hole, and it's also not really possible to place nature in our economies, but we need to place our economies within nature. And in that, conservation and restoration, and also the integration of nature in financial decision making, it does not happen by itself, but we show that by doing these type of investment cases or by doing these type of impact assessments, will increase the benefits for not only investments themselves, but also for our social, cultural, and also actually food systems and our economies at large. And also, maybe to close it, that by undervaluing nature, we are not really only ignoring the importance of nature for her own sake, but also ignoring it for the sake of our communities, our societies, and actually your own investments. Nature is still undervalued, and we really need to redefine our economic systems and the way that we think about investment in terms of discount rates, time horizons, and looking at all ecosystem services, also these regulating ecosystem services. And using monetary valuation is a way and is a path we're exploring. And to really end with a final quote, I want to thank you all for your participation and also for being so lively. That's very nice. We also learn a lot from this type of interaction and co-creation. But as Winston Churchill once quoted, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." I smile at it, but it's not actually really funny. But it's also, of course, accounts to the nature crisis that we are in. And that's also our call to action, to join our mission and the mission that we all have to contribute to solving nature crises, and to feel free also to reach out to us if you want to explore opportunities, are in dire need of some presentations on this topic, or have any other questions. So join PBAF, ESP, and reach out to us for thinking about integration of nature into decision making. So thank you once again for your participation, and I hope to see you again in the future. Bye-bye. And thanks all also who joined, Caroline, Sietse,
Thank you,
Roel,
Vince.
Karin, Mieke, Iska. Yes. Bye-bye.